Good afternoon. Welcome to Understanding Trauma in the Classroom. I am so thrilled that you have chosen to join us and be here with us today as we talk about teachers and how we can address this ongoing need, frankly, in our classroom. And I'm so thrilled that you think of it as an important exercise to be here. There are over 500 of you out there, and it's a little bit intimidating as I look at the video camera thinking about that. But as I thought more about the number that joined for this particular session, I thought, how beautiful is it that teachers think this is such an important topic to grow and understand and learn in. So I'm thrilled that you're here. I hope that what we talk about today, number one, encourages you. Number two, emboldens you. And number three, teaches you. You take something away today. You know, in a perfect world, frankly, we wouldn't be having this conversation. In a perfect world, all children would be safe. All children would be well developed, and all children would be encouraged to live their very best lives. But unfortunately, as we all know, we know that we don't live in a perfect world. Frankly, far from it. We live in a world cursed by sin, laden down with problems, with tragedy, with terror, and frankly, with trauma. I recognize that some of what we're going to talk about today could potentially be triggering for some of you. I want you to know that you are among friends. It's not at all my intention to be triggering today, but I want to be informative. I want to be helpful so that we, as Christian educators, can be the hands, the feet, the eyes of Jesus to those in our classroom. Among our colleagues, in our churches, so many people who have experienced the negative impact of trauma in their own lives. So I am coming to you today speaking as someone who's very passionate about this topic. I want to be an agent of change in the Christian world in regards to trauma. It is real. It is not a social construct. No longer can we hide our heads in the sand and ignore it. We cannot hope it will go away. We have to act. I also speak to you today as one who has experienced trauma herself. In fact, as far as statistics go, frankly, I shouldn't be even standing here in front of you today. Traumatic events such as abuse, substance abuse, incarceration, mental illness, and neglect are riddled throughout my story. But the grace of God, He reached down in my life and He plucked me out of that trajectory of trauma, and He gave me a new pathway. And one of the conduits for that pathway that I'm talking about are teachers. Teachers who took a strong interest in me and encouraged me to be something other than what it seemed I was destined to be. Speaking of the grace of God, I want to introduce you to, my family. I went ahead too quickly there. These are my people. These are the people that have supported me throughout my entire marriage with my husband, 24 years. His name is Jeff. He's a professor here at Bob Jones as well. My children, Ethan, Trey, and Livia. Ethan is my oldest. He just got married in January, and as probably some of you who have married children know, you like to brag about that, and so I always have to show the picture. And then my daughter-in-law, Karis, they live here in town near us, and we're thankful for that. My son, Trey, is a sophomore at Bob Jones, and he's studying engineering, and then my daughter will be a senior in high school this year. So we are very closely coming to the empty nest stage, which is overwhelming at times to think about. But these are my people, and God has used them in my life to refine me and to encourage me, and I'm thankful for that. Before we jump into understanding as educators how we handle trauma in the classroom, we frankly need to take time to recognize, what exactly trauma is. Childhood should be carefree. Wouldn't you agree? In fact, Mr. David Pelzer, author of A Child Called It, said this: "Childhood should be carefree, playing in the sun, not living in a nightmare in the darkness of the soul. Mr. David Pelzer is a well-known author. His book, A Child Called It, a New York Times bestseller, describes from his viewpoint the severe abuse he suffered as a child. He writes how his mother was physically and emotionally abusive toward him from ages 4 to 12. He described how his mom starved him, forced him to drink ammonia, stabbed him in the stomach, burned his arm on a gas stove, and forced him to eat his own vomit. He mentioned that his father was not active in resolving or even stopping the conflicts between himself and his mom. He was sent to a foster family at the age of 12 in 1973. David's quote, "Childhood should be carefree, playing in the sun, not living a nightmare in the darkness of the soul," is frankly one that sticks with you. Yes, childhood should be carefree, not burdensome, not traumatic. And yet, how many children experience the darkness that David alludes to? So, definition-wise, let's kind of get that out of the way, talking about when I say trauma, what am I talking about? It's kind of one of those words that is thrown around a lot in our culture today. So let's define it as we're going to talk about it today. Trauma is defined as, it's a three-pronged definition. Number one, it's an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. Okay, that's number one. That someone experiences. That is number two, physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. Okay, so it's an experience or a set of experiences that someone experiences that is physically and emotionally abusive, number two. And then number three, it has lasting adverse effects. Okay, three-pronged definition there. So when we're talking about trauma today, that's what we're talking about. Traumatic events range from one-time incidences to experiences that are chronic and frankly even generational. So we're going to just kind of jump in today talking about the three types of trauma and what they might look like. And as we do, I want you to be thinking about, okay, what does this look like in my own school or my community, in my classroom? How does this manifest itself? So let's talk about trauma type number one. Number one is called acute trauma. When I mean acute, it means it's a single, isolated incident. It's not something that's ongoing or chronic or anything like that. We're talking about a one-time thing, okay? This could be something like an accident. A car accident could be considered an acute trauma. It could be something like a natural disaster, you know, somebody going through a hurricane or a tornado or a flood, you know, something like that could be very, very devastating and would be considered a trauma in that person's life. A single act of violence or terrorism. The thing that comes immediately to my mind is the incident that happened down in Texas, the school shooting down there would be considered a traumatic event for those children that, and frankly teachers that experienced that. And then sudden unexpected loss. It could be through death, through suicide, through a loss of a friendship, those kinds of things. So there is acute trauma, just a single isolated event. We move on then to chronic trauma is the second type of trauma that we're going to kind of be referring to today. And this is, these are traumatic experiences that they're repeated, they're prolonged. That's why it's called chronic, okay? These are things like prolonged family or community violence, somebody living in an area that is very violent, if you will, or in a home that is very violent. A long-term illness could be considered a chronic trauma. It is impacting us long-term, whether it's my long-term illness or the long-term illness maybe of someone like a sibling or a parent, those kinds of things. Chronic bullying, chronic poverty, related stressors that are in that, exposure to war, to torture, to forced displacement, those kinds of things. All of these things would be chronic trauma. So we've got acute trauma, we've got chronic trauma. And then the third type of trauma, and this is the one that we are going to focus more heavily on today, and this is the trauma when we think about our classrooms. This is probably what many of our children that are coming from those traumatic situations are dealing with, okay? And so how do we handle that in the classroom? And this is complex trauma. And this is the idea where a child or a person, an adult, has been exposed to multiple traumatic events from an early age. Okay? More often than not, those events happen, that trauma exists within the spectrum where it ought not, in the caregiving system. People that should not be hurting them are hurting them, or at the very least, not helping them. So, a little bit of a review here. Okay, what can trauma include? Trauma can include things like emotional abuse or neglect. It can include domestic or community violence, school violence or bullying, sexual abuse, natural or man-made disasters, war, terrorism, refugee conditions even, medical trauma. All of those things are what trauma can include. So, as we kind of defined what we're talking about today, I want you to think about this. Ask yourself this question and try to answer it. What groups of students in your school are likely to experience higher rates of potentially traumatic events? Exposure to violence outside of school, bullying, harassment, abuse, neglect, so on and so forth. You know them. You probably are picturing them, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here in this session today. So I want you to think about those people. And as we move on, talking about how to understand it and how to handle that kind of situation in my classroom, I want you to think about that group of students or those particular students. Knowing how the stress system in our bodies works helps us to understand our own stress reactions and those of others. It's really important to remember, as we're talking about trauma, it's important for us to remember that not every stress sets off a traumatic stress response. Did you know that some stress is good? Frankly, we need stress in our lives to grow and to become better. There are some amounts of stress that help us to do that very thing. And so up here I have kind of a trajectory of stress or trauma, if you will, and you can kind of take note of that here. We start with positive stress. This is the stress where my caregiving trusted adult is with me as I go through it, and that can offset the feeling of stress or anxiety or worry or fear or whatever I have, and that trusted adult kind of helps to temper that. I call this, I teach developmental psychology, and we call this emotional coaching. When children go through difficult things, fear, anxiety, worry, which they often do, they need to be coached through that. They don't know how to handle those big emotions on their own. They have to be taught how to do that. And positive stress with a trusted caregiver allows for that. Things like my first day of school, kindergarten. That's positive stress. How many moms, it would be a bad mama that would say, okay, honey, you're stressed, you're just going to stay home. Well, no, we want them to be stressed, and we want to teach them how to cope with that stress so that they can grow and learn how to be better, okay? Tolerable stress is the next kind of level up, if you will. So tolerable stress is, these are stresses that happen, they're big events, or they could even be a series of chronic events, if you will, but it's tolerable because there's a trusted adult that is helping that child navigate those stresses, those emotions, those things that are happening as a result of that stress. So, loss of a family member, a parent, a sibling, would be an extreme stress for a child. Very difficult thing. And I think we could all agree with that. That would be traumatic. However, it could be tolerable if there is a trusted adult that is emotionally coaching and helping that child to be able to navigate that new territory, if you will. Without that trusted support system, good stress, tolerable stress becomes what I call, and what frankly experts call, toxic stress. This is the idea that we've got these stress hormones that come. God had created our bodies this way. When we're stressed, our bodies kind of hormones are released, and the fight or flight syndrome comes in, and there is nobody there to support and help that child navigate the difficulties that are coming. So this would be something like, I live in a home where I'm witnessing chronic domestic abuse. My dad is beating up my mom on a regular basis, or I'm seeing my siblings being beat up on a regular basis. That would be very difficult for a child to navigate on their own. Chronic neglect, chronic abuse of children is another very toxic type of stress. You know, our body has normal alarm systems in our brains that God put in our little noggins. The brain is an organ, and it responds in various ways when we are feeling like we are under threat. Our brain mobilizes us to fight, to flight, or to freeze when we are in the face of a perceived threat. So I want you to think about this. I kind of created a little schemata here for us to help us understand what this might look like. It's very crude, and I understand that. Just bear with me if you will. You know, all of us, we like to be in a state of what scientists call homeostasis. This is the I liked being here. There's no drama. There's no problems. I'm real cool, calm, and collected. We all like to be there, okay? However, we all know that we don't stay there. Why? Because we live in a fallen world, a sin-cursed world. We are being threatened. Our homeostasis is being threatened on a regular basis, often more times than we like to admit, frankly. So, homeostasis, and then boom. We're faced with a threat, although we do fret when we are threatened. So we're faced with a threat, and it could be just a perceived threat. So I want you to think about this. You're walking down the sidewalk, and if you're like me, I am scared to death of snakes. I hate them. I think I hate them more than any other animal. I really do not like them. I'm terrified of snakes. I walk down the sidewalk, and I see a snake, okay? Now, what would you do? What does your body do in that moment? Well, your brain recognizes snake, and then what happens is hormones are released. And what starts happening? Well, if you're anything like me, your palms start sweating, your heart starts going like this. Oops, sorry. And you start maybe hyperventilating, or you want to scream, or you freeze because you don't know what to do. It's a stress response. This is how God wired us, frankly, so we protect ourselves. What a beautiful design of our Creator, isn't it? It's such a beautiful thing. However, when we come down off of that, after I recognize, oh, that wasn't a snake, that was a twig. I come down off of that high, and you know what happens to me? I get in what's called a state of exhaustion. After all those hormones are released and my heart's going like crazy and I'm like, and you're in this state of exhaustion. And that's how God created us. This is the stress cycle. That's a good thing. However, chronic stress, a child who exists in a situation where the system becomes overwhelmed. In other words, they're in constant fight or flight or freeze mode. Fight, flight, freeze. And they never come down. They never return to homeostasis. Their body, their hormones remain elevated. And we have physical issues because of that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. It creates what I call, and what scientists call, an overactive alarm system, frankly, in the developing brain, particularly. So a youth's brain, their body that develops within the context of chronic stress, chronic trauma, can be more easily triggered by certain triggers that we're going to talk about here, even when there's no actual threat. Something to think about. I don't know if you've ever heard of the study by the Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. They did a study in 1998. They studied 17,000 mostly white, college-educated, employed adults. They were screened for what they came up with 10 prominent childhood traumatic experiences. And they did this as part of their routine health care at Kaiser. Okay. Each type of trauma, so if the person went through a certain type of trauma, they were awarded 1 point for each type of trauma of the 10 they went through. The types of ACEs would be things like abuse, neglect, any kind of household challenges. So this would be emotional, physical, sexual abuse. This could be emotional, physical neglect. It could be things like substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, suicidal thoughts, divorce, your parents being divorced or separated, incarceration, so on and so forth. You get the idea here. And what's so interesting about this study, by the way, that is still continuing, 70% of the 17,000 had experienced at least one type of the 10 traumas. Okay, all right. You're like, okay, Christina, big deal. Whoopity-doo-dah. Okay, well, ACE scores of 4 or more resulted in 4 times the risk of emphysema or chronic bronchitis, 4 times the likelihood of depression, and 12 times, listen to me now, the risk of suicide. ACE scores were directly related with early initiation of smoking, sexual activity, adolescent pregnancy, and risk for partner violence. Trauma is a neurodevelopmental insult. It impacts the development of the brain, and it becomes problematic for the child. You see, what happens is trauma-impacted students wind up having difficulty handling themselves in public situations, and particularly in the classroom. So they have problems with, as you might have experienced, in managing their big emotions. They've got these conflicting emotions going on in their hearts and their minds, and they don't know how to handle them. They don't know what to do with them. Why? Well, it goes back to, remember we talked about emotional coaching during stressful situations? They weren't emotionally coached during that. They also have problems with chronic irritability or anxiety levels. They have problems with empathy, having empathy towards others. Empathy is taught. They have a problem expressing themselves, their own needs, their concerns, those kinds of things. They can't see the big picture. All they can see is this tunnel vision and how things impact them. They have a hard time understanding how their behavior impacts other people and how the domino effect happens. And then because of all of that, they struggle to work in groups, and they struggle with connecting with others in and outside of the classroom. Y'all, this is a problem. This can really impact negatively my classroom culture, my classroom management, if you will. What do we do with this? You see, what happens with these children is they have what's called triggers, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit before. Those trauma triggers, they're common. They activate that survival brain, that they're triggered is a threat, and then they go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and then they act out because of that, because they're just trying to survive what's happening in the here and now. And it's so interesting, when youth are in what I call a triggered state, guess what they's not doing? They aren't learning. They're not learning. They can't learn. They're not in a rational state of mind. They're in the emotional brain, if you will, has taken over, and it's completely irrational and cannot be reasoned with. Very, very difficult. So some of those common trauma triggers are things like unpredictability. If they don't see what's coming and I change something too quickly, we could have a meltdown on our hands and a major outburst, if you will. Sensory overload, when there's too much noise, too much things coming into their eyes. They're tactile, defensive, if you will. These are issues for them. When they feel vulnerable, like they feel like as if the whole world is looking at me and I am on display, I'm vulnerable here and I don't want to be here. Or they're frustrated, could be a very common trauma trigger. And then confrontation. Somebody confronts them maybe about a negative behavior or about something that they are not ready, if you will, to deal with. That could be another trigger as well. So, I often get asked this next question. But Christina, why are we talking about this? This only happens in the public schools, right? I mean, come on. This doesn't happen in Christian schools. Well, lest you wonder. A report from the National Survey on Children's Health made headlines in October of 2017 with the finding that nearly 47% of all children in the United States have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. Half of our kids, one. Nearly 22% have 2 or more ACEs. So a fifth of our kids have 2 or more of those problematic issues. Okay? This is also happening to young children. 35% of all children had at least one ACE by the time they were in kindergarten. You think about this, if you know anything about brain health, the brain is 90% of brain development happens before age 5. You put those two pieces together. If we're experiencing serious trauma before age 5, what is that doing to my developing brain? And then findings from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention indicate that ACEs are common across households at all income and education levels and across all races. Listen to me, people. Listen to me, lest you be fooled. This is no respecter of persons. Does it exist in a Christian school? You better believe it. And honestly, nowadays, our world and the way our culture is, so many kids are coming to our classrooms carrying this baggage, and they've not had adults help them. And maybe you could be that person. You know, these are depressing statistics. They are. I don't want to leave you in the depression mode, if you will. There is some hope. There is. There is additional research and ideas that point to buffers that provide the means for children to not only bounce back, but bounce forward. They can succeed. Listen, y'all. I'm telling you, by the time I was 5 years old, I had experienced 9 of the 10 ACEs that are listed in the Kaiser study. 9 of the 10. I shouldn't be here if the statistics were accurate. However, I already mentioned the grace of God, and I already mentioned teachers. You see, having 2 or more ACEs does not determine a child's destiny, as long as there's some supportive buffers in place to help them work through those adversities. So what does this mean for me as a teacher? What does this mean for your school? The greater number of ACEs that children experience, listen to me, is the greater likelihood that they will struggle academically and disengage from school. So the more ACEs, the more problems. It's kind of this inverse relationship, if you will. No, I'm sorry, it's not inverse, it's a relationship. The more over here, the more it's gonna go up here like this. It's a positive relationship. But maintaining a strong connection to their school and to at least one caring adult makes all the world of difference. You see, this helps to build what we call resiliency in children. Resiliency is key. Why do some kids make it even though they've been through horrific experiences and others don't? The answer is resiliency. What is resiliency? This is the ability to recover from those difficult experiences, trauma, if you will, to adapt, to move forward, and frankly, to sometimes experience growth in spite of what you've been through. That's what resiliency is. What helps resiliency to develop? I've included a few things here. These are the most, probably the things that seem to be the strongest things that build resiliency in children that have been through trauma. A sense of purpose. This is their faith, their culture, their identity, their work, if you will, gives them a sense of purpose that builds resiliency. Individual competencies, finding what they're good at. Listen to me very carefully. Even the kids in your classroom that are your worst behaved because they come from these traumatic situations, they've got something they're good at. Find it, build it. That is going to help build their resiliency. Social connections, school, church, extracurricular activities, all of these things build resiliency. Support services. I want you to take a hard look at your school. What support do you have in place for kids who struggle? I'm not just talking about struggling academically. I'm talking about kids who are struggling socially, who are struggling to connect because they come from difficult situations. They have to be practical and available to these kids. And yes, Christian schools, we ought to have them. We ought to have them. And then a close relationship with caring adults. You see, according to studies, the most significant determinant of resilience is the quality of our close personal relationships, specifically our parents and our primary caregivers. Teachers matter. Teachers matter. Listen, teacher, you matter to that kid who's bringing that baggage into your classroom. They need you. Very few resilient people, says Dr. Southwick. He's a professor of psychiatry at Yale University. Very few resilient people go it alone. They need you. They need you. Teacher, you matter. So then we come to the crux of the matter. How can I, as a teacher, I've got these kids in my classroom, I love them. I want to be the hands and the feet and the eyes of Jesus to them. I want to support them. I want them to grow, to be resilient. What can I do? We need to have a trauma-informed approach. Y'all, we are living in a culture where, yes, even our Christian homes, unspeakable things are happening to our kids. Things that years ago were just brushed under the rug. A blind eye was given. No longer, teacher. Today, we are going to recognize that some of our kids are carrying baggage that no child ought ever to carry. And how can we support them? We need to be trauma-informed. This shifts from a model. See, old model says, what's wrong with you? New model says this, what happened to you? I can have grace when I look at it from that perspective. When I think about these kids and I think, what happened? Let me share a little anecdote and then I'll share with you some strategies. When I did my special education practicum, I was new to the idea of emotional behavior disorders in the classroom. I was not aware of them. I just was a little uneducated in that area, and so I was learning kind of as a baptism by fire, if you will, in the special ed classroom that I was in. We had a young girl, she was 8 years old, and she had reactive attachment disorder. What this is a disorder that basically a child will they have weird attachment issues, and so they'll attach to an adult, they'll cling to them almost like a leech, and then something will trigger them, and they will basically detach, and usually detach in a very negative and a very violent way. So this young lady had reactive attachment disorder. She was very attached to her teacher, her special education teacher, who was 9 months pregnant at the time. Something happened in the classroom. The little girl was kind of leeching onto the teacher and was really, connected to her. And then something triggered her. We don't know what it was. And she literally went from attached to detached in a matter of seconds. And she became violent, so violent that she began kicking the stomach of the 9-month pregnant teacher. And so the other special ed teacher had to come in and do what we call restraint and seclusion to actually restrain her in an appropriate way so that she would stop being violent. In the middle of that restraining, the little girl who was 8 years old took, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, she literally took a chunk of flesh. Bit a chunk of flesh out of the special educator's arm. I was horrified. I had never seen, I've seen a lot in my life, but I had never seen anything to that extreme. And I was mad, frankly. I'm just going to be really honest with you. I was offended. I thought, what on earth? This little girl needs to be taken care of. And then the teacher sat me down and we debriefed. And she told me that little girl's story. In the 8 years that that little girl had been alive, things had happened to her that I cannot publicly speak about. Things that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Things that a child should never endure. That was a crisis moment for me in my understanding of trauma. And I began to think, oh, wow, okay, what happened to you? And how can I teach you now that I understand what happened to you? So, we need to invest great energy, great resources up front. We need to be proactive schools and teachers in order to support our young people's long-term success. That's what we're here for. So I'm going to give you some strategies here. This is very overly philosophical. I'm just going to be really honest with you. Not a whole. I'll give you some where the rubber meets the road. But if at the end, if you want to ask some questions regarding that, okay, what does this look like practically speaking? We can talk about that. Number one, I would say strategy number one is what we call in education universal supports. This is what special education teachers, education in general calls positive behavior intervention system. What does that mean? Well, that's a big old honking word. I know it is. It's a big old word. What is this saying? It's basically saying I am creating a positive school climate, a learning environment where all kids feel safe. They feel secure. They feel supported. What does this look like? I am being proactive rather than reactive. So, some examples of PBIS systems in schools today. So when you walk into a school and there is a no bullying campaign, that is a PBIS system. Or there's a zero tolerance rule in place. That's a PBIS system. PBIS system could look something as simple as we don't talk in the hallways. We only talk on the playground. That could look something like this. We are trying to make an effort to have students feel like they're warmly embraced and they're secure. They know what to expect in our school environment. And yes, Christian schools need to do this as well. Secondly is what I would say consistency. Strategy number two is consistency. What do I mean by this? If I've got kids that are dealing with trauma or bringing the baggage of those trauma experiences into my classroom, I'm telling you, teacher, consistency matters. If I have got a rule, I am consistently enforcing that rule. I have visual routines and schedules posted, not just, spouting off a bunch of stuff, verbally speaking. We're pairing the verbal with the visual. I'm setting clear and very consistent expectations. Kids know what to expect from me. I just taught last hour on how there are certain teacher behaviors that encourage misbehaviors in students, and one of them is when I am not consistent in enforcing my classroom rules. That just encourages student misbehavior. So kids know what to expect from me. They feel secure and they feel warmly embraced in my classroom because of that consistency. But I can also be flexible. I always tell people, listen, the more flexible I am is how consistent I am with my expectations. Number three. And a lot of teachers bucket this. This is a big, I get it, I understand. But if you've got a kid or multiple children who are behavior problems in your class, particularly if they're bringing some trauma issues in, listen, wherever you can, give them choice. Give them an option A or option B. Which would you prefer? You could do this or you could do that. If you've got a project, they could do a video, they could do a PowerPoint. You've got a spelling test, they can do it orally, they can do it written. Wherever you can, teachers, give them choice. Listen to me very carefully. Kids who come from trauma, they live lives that are out of control. Their lives are completely out of control. And so they do everything they can to control their lives. And if you can give them some semblance of control in those areas, I promise you, you will see a major difference in their behavior in the classroom. Listen to me, avoid power struggles. There are some battles that they just not worth fighting. Know those battles and find them. Number four. This is really important. Teachers, some of you, your kids are acting wrongly in the classroom or they're misbehaving or however you want to call it, is because you are misbehaving. You are not modeling for them appropriate behaviors when they're stressed. When I am stressed, how am I coming across to my students? Am I irritable? Am I sarcastic? Am I annoyed? Well, No wonder why my kids are doing sarcasm and annoyance and irritability. So teacher, you model that appropriate behavior. You model time management. You model frustration management. You model problem solving, and you teach them. I don't know why my slides keep moving ahead, but they're doing that. So I shape their behavior. I teach them how to do that. Another one is teaching social emotional skills. This is a big thing in the world of education right now. This has become a reality in the classroom, in public, in Christian, in private, it does not matter. We've got to teach our kids social emotional skills. Why? Because for myriads of reasons, and I'm not going to sit here and expound upon all the reasons, parents aren't teaching them. Kids aren't getting them at home. So unfortunately so, it lands on the shoulders of the teachers. And so, teacher, integrate social emotional learning into your classroom. Listen, you teach self-awareness and coping and relaxation during history. You teach it during math. You teach it during science. You teach it during English, and so on and so forth. You just embed those social emotional skills, and you share with them, hey, you know what, when I'm frustrated, I struggle with this too, and this is how I handle this. Teaching those social emotional skills is a really important way to help build their capacity to manage those strong emotions that come. Number 6, know your kids' triggers. Identify your particular student's triggers. What does this mean, teacher? Hey, listen, you got to know your kids. You got to know your kids. What does this mean? You got to get into their lives. You've got to get upfront and personal. You've got to talk to them. You've got to know their parents. You've got to know their situation. You won't be able to identify their triggers otherwise. Generally speaking, and I'm speaking very general, and behavior management is one of my favorite things to talk about and to implement in the classroom. And one of the things with behavior management we talk about is when a child displays a negative behavior, there is often something that happens right before that. We call it the antecedent that happens, that kind of triggers that negative behavior. And then once the negative behavior happens, there is often a what we call a consequence that reinforces that negative behavior. For example, you're in the classroom and Johnny calls out without raising his hand. Negative behavior, because I expect them to raise their hand, okay? The antecedent before that is I asked a question that Johnny knew. That's the thing that triggered the negative behavior. However, the consequence that's reinforcing that behavior is I allow Johnny to talk. I call on him. When I should say, Johnny, I will allow you to answer the question when you appropriately ask to be part of the class. That kind of a thing. You see what I'm saying? So identify those antecedents and consequences that are reinforcing those negative behaviors. And I will say this, listen to me. You've got some kids that are coming from trauma situations, and there are things that are unpredictable that trigger them. Things like fire drills. Teachers, if you've got a trauma-triggered student in your classroom, then you get to your administrator and you make them tell you when fire drills are happening, so that you can plan ahead to protect and help your child navigate that fire drill in an appropriate way. So we don't have a trauma response, a stress response for no reason. The final strategy is this, and I think this goes without saying, frankly, but I do like to hit on this. You know, you've got to build relationships with your kids. Teaching isn't all about just standing up here and being the Charlie Brown teacher and want, okay? Frankly, a monkey could do that. You need to know your kids. You need to know what makes your kids tick. You need to find ways to praise them, to compliment them. Listen to me, the worst kids in your classroom, there's something you can praise them for. You need to remember what they talk about, what's important to them. You remember when they say something negative or they bring an issue to you that's really problematic for them. You remember those things and you circle back around sometime the next day or the next week or whatever have you. You show up to their games. You show up to their plays, their recitals, their workplaces. You are present in their lives. You need to build relationships. I'm just going to tell you right now, resiliency is built best with a caring, supportive adult. And teacher, you might be the only one in that child's life. Be that one. Be that one. You see, students who are loved at home come to school to learn. That's why they come to school. Students who aren't, they come to school to be loved. And let me tell you something. It's those kids that are the problem, the trauma students. They're going to show up every day. They're going to be there. Why? They're trying to get out of their traumatic situations. And they are desperate for your love and for your concern for them. Do you remember that quotation from the beginning of our talk, the one that David Pelzer wrote? Childhood should be carefree. Well, in 1973, at the age of 12, after having been abused by his mother for more than 7 years, David was sent to the nurse at school. You see, that morning, his mom had bashed his head into the counter for no reason. David was 12, and this had become a familiar routine for him and for the school nurse. As usual, he lied to the nurse, and he gave her the ridiculous explanation that his mother, frankly, ordered him to recite. The nurse, she sensed something was wrong, and she checked her file on the boy. It was a thick file, riddled with signs of abuse. You see, in 1973, Child Protective Services did not exist. Teachers and school officials were risking their careers and accusations of slander when they accused parents of hurting their children. But on March 5th, 1973, the nurse had enough. She rallied support from 2 teachers and the school principal and called the local police, and David was removed from his home, never to return again. He is now a New York Times best-selling author of multiple books about his experiences. He's a motivational speaker. He often speaks to high school students and adults about the concept of resilience. So the question I have for you is, Christian teacher, will you be that teacher? All right, thank you for attending today. I wanted to share with you, this is the CEU session password, just in case that you were interested in getting credit. Thank you for attending. It really does warm my heart that there are so many out there of you that are concerned about our kids. Boy, they need you, and God bless you in your endeavors to teach them and to support them.
Well, thank you, Christina. I appreciate what you shared with us today.
Thank you.
It's been great. We've had a lot of response online.
Wonderful.
And so I have a couple questions for you. The first of which, how do we practically apply what's been learned today in the classroom?
Sure. There's what I talked about today is a lot of philosophy, a lot of kind of big picture, bird's eye view, if you will. There is a lot of content out there on the internet that really helps teachers understand what a trauma-informed approach looks like practically in the classroom. I would encourage you to look into that, to Google those resources, watch the videos that are out there, maybe get a couple of books and read up on that. This is not going away. And so we as teachers need to learn how to implement those things practically in our classrooms. I can't speak to all classrooms just because so many situations are varied and they're different. We can speak in generalities, but things like having consistent schedules and routines and praising when you can, those kinds of things will be helpful.
Here's another question from our audience. How do you help a student? What should you say to them if they just recently lost a sibling to suicide?
Ooh, that's a really That's a good question. Suicide, again, is no respecter of persons, and even in our Christian schools, we're seeing it. Honestly, I don't know that there is anything that you should say. I think what I would do in that situation, rather than talk about the situation, is I would build a relationship with that student first and seek to just support them emotionally, and whatever they bring up, I would kind of take their lead on that. And if I sense any kind of suicidal ideation or issues, I would also recommend counseling for them, whether it be through the school counselor or through a therapist or however, that kind of thing.
Okay. How do you support a student, and this is a balancing question, how do you support a student who is experiencing trauma while keeping confidentiality to the classroom
Sure.
and continuing to move through the year with your curriculum?
Yeah, that is a big question. And yeah, student confidentiality is a really important thing, and that's, it's kind of, it can be muddy, I guess is what I would say. I think how I would address that in the classroom is, we talk about the issue of fairness and what all students need in fairness. And the reality is that fairness for one is not, might not be fairness for another. And so maybe my overarching philosophy of my classroom is something that I would repeat on a continual basis, that some of us need certain things to be able to be successful in our classroom. Some of us need other things, and I want us to have a culture where we are accepting of each other. I think often classroom culture comes from the top down, and I think the more that we create a culture where people are warm and they're warmly valued and we are accepting of each other, I think you'll see those issues work themselves out, frankly, in the classroom.
This is one I dealt with as an administrator,
Okay.
and it's a student that's experiencing trauma,
Mm-hmm.
but their trauma is leading out to disruptive behavior
Yes.
that's in causing the whole class to have chaos.
Yes. And so what do you do with that?
Yeah.
Yes, that's a really good question. I actually teach another, and I'm not teaching at in this particular conference, but I teach a session on how to deal with negative behaviors that are escalating. So how to de-escalate negative behaviors. Because as we all know, when a kid gets into a spot where they're escalated, there are things that can trigger that escalation and create it to make it worse, and there are things that we can do to help it. One of the biggest things that I would recommend as a school, this is a PBIS, if you will. If your school does not have what we call a resource room, this would be a room that's separate from any other classroom, where kids come, they get pulled out maybe for reading remediation or math remediation. And in that room, every school should have what I call a sensory corner. And when we talk about sensory corner, we often think about, well, that's for preschoolers, that's for elementary schools. I'm telling you, this is necessary for pre-K all the way up through high school. They need a safe space where they can go if they are in a triggered state. Obviously, if they're in a triggered state, they're not in a learning mode, and then the rest of your class is not learning. So we've got to have processes in place where we remove them from the classroom, get them into a sensory safe environment where they can they can calm down, they can de-escalate, and then we can talk to them when they're in a more rational state. Some of those things that you can include in a sensory corner would be, sensory cushy things, pillows, low lighting. In high school, they do lavender lotion and, adult coloring books and music and, those kinds of things. I'd be happy to talk with somebody about that. If you want to shoot me an email, I can give you more advice on that.
How does a teacher identify a student that's going through trauma? Maybe they are being disruptive, maybe they're not. How do you identify that?
Yeah, there are some kids. It's so interesting when we talk about kids that are expressing negative behaviors or through trauma. Some of those behaviors are going to be very overt. And what happens in the classroom is those overt kids get all the attention because it's like right out there and I see it. However, there are some kids that are a little more internal they internalize their trauma, if you will, and they're dealing with quiet anxiety, quiet depression. It could even be eating disorders, those kinds of things. And to be able to recognize when those things are happening is you've got to know your kids. You've got to be intentional in getting involved in their lives, even those quiet ones. So if you've got someone who's a little more introverted, is a little more reticent to talk, it really is important that you make connections with them in whatever way works for them. Get to know their situation, maybe even journal. A lot of my reticent students, I've journaled with them, so I would just, write a little happy note to them, and I just told them, this is a journal. If you want to ask me a question or you want to write something, this is a judgment-free zone. This is here for me to be a help and an encouragement to you. That has really worked very well with a lot of those students. So.
Next, we have, how do you help a 10-year-old student who has responded to trauma by just completely shutting down, become a slow processor, is almost frozen in the classroom?
Yeah, to me, again, that student, it sounds like that student needs individual attention. In my opinion, if I had someone like that in my classroom, I would ask for remediation. So I probably would ask for them to be pulled, whether it's in the resource room or a parent volunteer, somebody who could do some individualized learning with them, because it sounds like they need to get to a spot where they can learn again, and a lot of times they need that one-on-one nudge to get there.
Well, that is all the questions we have from our audience. Thank you so much for sharing this very relevant but unfortunate conversation dealing with trauma. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And thank you again for coming. God bless you all.